Yeah, so let's kind of move on from Austin Watkins and get into Richie James Jr. a little bit. A lot of 49er fans really high on Richie James Jr. coming out seventh round pick a couple years back. And you kind of just look at his mold 5'10, 185. I've always thought of him as, a little bit more of a burner than a lot of other guys on the 49ers roster. Interestingly, though, he only ran a 4.48 coming out of school, which I did not realize that was his 40 time. So not super good. But then you kind of look at how he gets open, and a lot of it's quickness. So, I mean, you get open and you are able to spread the field vertically. It doesn't really matter how you do it, if it's, straight line speed or just this ability to get open and be a quick player. But last season, 394 yards and one touchdown. And very funny, 184 and one touchdown came against the Packers. So almost all of his production in one game where he was basically the featured wide receiver with a lot of guys out. I think that's promising for him. But what do you kind of see his role what do you think his role is gonna be this season?
So I have an interesting Richie James kind of thought. We're pretty sure that he's going to make the roster. I think he's going to make the roster, but his primary use last year and his primary use as this undrafted free agent was as a kick returner. The Niners drafted two guys, Ambry Thomas and Elijah Mitchell, who both can return kicks. And Shanahan, he and Richie James have a weird thing going on where every Niner fan feels that Richie James should play more, but Shanahan doesn't play him. I feel like he's that would be my hot take is Richie James either gets traded or doesn't make the roster, and a guy like Sanu makes the roster. If he's not returning kicks well, I don't. Obviously, we're not at practice, so we're not able to see it. But that's kind of the hot take. But that said, I definitely expect him to make the roster. Kind of just something to think about. But he doesn't really do anything crazy. He's solid. I think that he should have somewhere around 30 catches. Last year he had 23. And I think, Matt, you said four touchdowns should be the goal, which is something interesting to really think about.
Yeah, no, and you kind of talking about him potentially not making the roster. I'm assuming that comes from not really like, oh, this guy's not good enough to make the roster, but just like he hasn't really been utilized.
Exactly.
And a lot of people have wanted him to be on the field more, and he just hasn't. And, for forever what reason that is, we just haven't seen that. So maybe he's a guy that needs to benefit from a quarterback that can spread the field more vertically. Maybe that's part of the reason. Maybe if Trey Lance comes out, like we're going to see more of Richie James. I'm not really sure. But I think you're right about kind of just bringing up like, hey, he was the kick returner. That was one of his main responsibilities. I know that one of our listeners said that they fully expect like Ambry Thomas to be the guy that returns kicks. And if Elijah Mitchell can do that as well, like those guys are probably more likely to be, the kick returner and the punt returners. But Richie James, I mean, I do think he's going to kind of be this third wide receiver. So it's interesting that you kind of think that there's a chance that he doesn't make the roster, which I think is totally fair, just because it has been weird how he's been used in his time in San Francisco. But what I'm kind of thinking is is he can play that Taylor Gabriel role from the 2016 Falcons offense. Now, I don't think he's going to put up the same production that Taylor Gabriel did. That offense threw the ball a lot more than this Niners offense is probably planning to. And I expect Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle to take, almost all of those touches. I think that both of them are probably shooting for about 90 catches this year or 90 touches because, we've seen Brandon Ayuk used in the past game a little bit more. But he can be a very productive complementary piece. And you brought up the 4 touchdowns. I think if Richie James has 4 touchdowns, I think that shows that if he is the wide receiver 3, that he played his role pretty well. And, he caught the defense lacking a few times throughout the year. 4 touchdowns, hopefully some bigger shots. I think but that's a big deal when you kind of start looking at, hey, the defense had to respect him enough that he had 4 touchdowns on about like 30 catches or so. I think that's what we should expect out of him. And in terms of yards, I think a lot of them are just going to be shots and, blown coverages and whatnot when he's in the game. But I think one of the other things is it's hard to kind of evaluate him when he's not being schemed to get open, besides that Packers game, which he looked so good in. it's Brandon Ayuk, Debo Samuel, George Kittle, and the run game that's really getting schemed up to flourish. The offense isn't focusing on, oh, we got to get Richie James' touches. So, like, what he's able to do is going to be based on what the defense is kind of the looks that the defense are giving. So, I would love if he could get 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's kind of one of those things where, like, I definitely expect him to make the roster, but he's kind of a guy who is either going to be wide receiver 3, or I think that's a 90% chance, and there's a 10% chance that he doesn't make the roster. He's in the last year of his contract. That's something to keep in mind. And there's just so many unknowns surrounding this guy. When he's on the field, he's been good. He's dealt with a couple injuries, but he hasn't gotten the opportunity, like you said, for us to really evaluate him.
One guy that could potentially kind of steal his targets a little bit and maybe steal his role even would be a guy like Travis Benjamin. Obviously, he opted out for the 2020 year, so we haven't seen him in a Niners uniform. But Travis Benjamin is a burner. He's a guy that could definitely play that vertical role and really spread the defense. I don't know what he has left in the tank. I mean, he's been in the league for quite a while, but I definitely think, like, if there's a way where Richie James isn't that true third wide receiver, and also if we're saying like wide receiver 3, I still expect Jalen Hurd to get more touches, but he's going to be used more as a gadget player. So wide receiver 3 is really like, how often is he lining up, in that slot or in that outside role? And I just think that he's going to be one of the guys that kind of is or listed on the depth chart as the third wide receiver, which doesn't mean all that much at the end of the day. But I think this role of spreading the field vertically, he could lose it to Travis Benjamin. And I think that's a very possible thing that could happen. And I know, we've seen Richie James on the team for a lot longer. So I think a lot of fans are going to go like, hey, I'd rather see Richie out there. I would as well. But I think that would just be if Travis basically beats him out, which I don't think that we should be like, I mean, competition is great, but I don't think that we should really be like rooting for an older player like Travis Benjamin to start getting, a lot of catches and a lot of touches. I think having these younger players like a Richie James, like a Jalen Hurd or an Austin Watkins, I think that's better, especially than the Travis Benjamins and Mohamed Sanu's. But a guy that's definitely the guy that I think that he's competing with for that kind of role to go out there and run a lot of posts, run a lot of streaks, seams, a lot of stuff like that, where he's really just trying to keep the defense honest. And I don't know, that's the guy I kind of think that he will be competing with a little bit. But do you think Travis Benjamin is kind of the guy that he's mostly going to be competing with in camp?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I feel like we're talking about these guys and we're trying to replace what Kendrick Bourne brought. Obviously, he didn't have the speedster element that we didn't have with anybody last year. But I kind of look at it as Austin Watkins. That might be that third down guy. Hurd could be pretty much everything else. And Benjamin could add something new. It's just interesting to really think about, but I think you and I are both on the same wavelength in that we expect Richie James to make the roster and to improve on last year, kind of in a contract year.